where silence became strategy. Silence is usually mistaken for hesitation, for weakness, for the absence of leadership. But there are moments when silence is chosen deliberately, when speaking too early would do more harm than saying nothing at all. This story matters today because the loudest voices often shape the narrative, not the smartest decisions. In a world addicted to instant reaction, silence can feel dangerous. Yet for one sheik, silence was not avoidance. It was strategy. The moment arrived during a regional dispute that escalated faster than anyone predicted. Statements flooded the media. Allies demanded alignment. Opponents waited for a misstep. Advisors drafted responses designed to dominate the conversation before it turned hostile. Every instinct pushed toward speed. He resisted, not because he lacked position, but because he understood timing. Speaking now would lock the narrative before the truth had fully surfaced. It would reward outrage with relevance, and it would force him into a posture defined by reaction rather than intent. So he chose silence. No denial, no clarification, no reassurance, just restraint. The reaction was immediate confusion. Commentators speculated. Rivals tested boundaries. Even supporters questioned the absence of response. Silence, in a world trained to equate noise with strength, felt like vulnerability. But beneath the noise, something else was happening. With no official position to react against, misinformation lost momentum. Contradictions emerged. Those driving the escalation revealed their incentives too quickly. Without opposition, exaggeration collapsed under its own weight. Silence began doing what speeches could not. It exposed motive. Internally, he watched carefully. Data replaced commentary. Patterns emerged. The dispute was less about principle than leverage, less about resolution than advantage. Had he spoken early, that truth would have remained buried beneath performance. This was a reveal. Silence was not empty. It was gathering information. And as the situation evolved without his voice shaping it, he prepared for the moment when silence would no longer serve strategy, but action would. Because silence only works when it is temporary. And knowing when to break, it is what separates restraint from retreat. That moment was approaching fast. As the silence stretched on, pressure intensified from every direction. Allies worried the absence of response would be interpreted as indecision. Opponents framed it as weakness. Media cycles filled the void with speculation, each narrative growing bolder in the absence of contradiction. Silence, once strategic, began to feel risky. Inside the palace, debates sharpened. Some advisors argued that perception was becoming reality. They warned that waiting any longer would allow false assumptions to harden into belief. Others insisted the silence was already working, pointing to inconsistencies emerging among those escalating the dispute. The room divided not on intent, but on patience. He listened unmoved, because the signal he was watching for had not yet appeared. That signal arrived quietly. A shift in tone from one of the loudest voices driving the conflict. Their demands softened. Their certainty wavered. Inconsistencies in their claims were no longer being explained, only repeated. Silence had forced exposure. Without resistance to refine their narrative, their position began to unravel. At the same time, private channels opened. Backroom communications surfaced. Requests for clarification replaced public threats. The absence of a response had created uncertainty, not about strength, but about leverage. Without knowing where he stood, opponents could not calculate risk. Silence had denied them a target. This was a turning point. The dispute had reached a moment where truth was visible, but fragile. Speak too early, and it would be buried again. Wait too long, and confusion would harden into mistrust. Strategy demanded precision now, not restraint. He began preparing to break the silence, not with rebuttal, but with structure, not with emotion, but with facts. The response would not chase the narrative, it would reset it. But timing remained everything. One misstep would undo weeks of advantage. As the situation teetered between exposure and escalation, he knew the next move would define whether silence was remembered as wisdom or rewritten as failure. The moment to speak was near, and when he did, the silence that came before would make every word impossible to ignore. When he finally spoke, it was not to answer accusations. It was to change the frame entirely. He began by outlining facts that had gone unchallenged during the noise, timeline incentives, and contradictions that silence had allowed to surface naturally. Each point landed with weight precisely because it arrived without urgency. The conflict crystallized in real time. Those who had driven the dispute found themselves reacting instead of leading. Their narratives, once loud, now felt incomplete. Attempts to deflect only highlighted the gap silence had already exposed. The conversation shifted from outrage to accountability. He did not assign blame. He defined conditions, clear principles, verifiable data, boundaries that separated legitimate concern from manufactured pressure. The message was measured, but firm. Engagement to continue only where transparency existed. Escalation without substance would be ignored. The effect was immediate. Allies recalibrated. Opponents reassessed. Media coverage slowed, forced to reconcile spectacle with substance. The dispute, once fueled by momentum, lost its energy when momentum was replaced by structure. But the most important shift happened internally. Leaders recognized that silence had not been absence. It had been preparation. Speaking too early would have locked them into a reactive position. Waiting had allowed leverage to reveal itself. Strategy had been shaped not by emotion, but by observation. The turning point came when one of the primary instigators withdrew publicly, reframing their position without acknowledgement of retreat. It was not victory, it was containment. The conflict no longer threatened stability. Silence had done its work, yet the cost was real. Weeks of pressure, doubt, accusations of weakness. He absorbed them without response, knowing that restraint demanded endurance. Strategy without patience collapses under scrutiny. As calm returned, the lesson settled. Silence is not power. Silence is preparation. And when paired with precision, it becomes the most disruptive force of all. The final question remained. Could this approach survive repetition? Because strategy that works once becomes expectation the next time. And expectation invites manipulation. The next test would determine whether silence could remain a choice, or whether it would be mistaken for a pattern to exploit. That test was already forming. The next test arrived sooner than expected. Another dispute surfaced, smaller but louder, designed to provoke the same restraint. This time, silence was anticipated. Those driving the noise assumed repetition would dull its effect. That patience could be exploited as passivity. He adjusted. Silence, he understood, loses power when it becomes predictable. Strategy must evolve, or it becomes habit. So instead of withholding his voice entirely, he spoke early, but narrowly. A brief statement, clear boundaries, no engagement beyond facts. Then silence returned. The effect was immediate. The attempt to manufacture pressure collapsed. Without space to escalate, outrage lost its oxygen. The contrast revealed the lesson clearly. Silence was never the strategy. Judgment was. The climax was not dramatic. It was definitive. Those watching closely understood that restraint was not a fixed posture. It was a calibrated tool, deployed when it served clarity and withdrawn when it invited manipulation. Silence was no longer a mystery to exploit. It was a discipline to respect. The resolution unfolded with quiet authority. Future disputes de-escalated faster. Actors recalculated incentives. Silence, once misunderstood, gained credibility precisely because it was not automatic. It was intentional. Standing alone afterward, he reflected on what had been built, not a habit of withholding speech, but a reputation for speaking only when it mattered. The world adjusted its behavior accordingly. He had proven something essential. Strategy is not about saying nothing. It is about knowing when silence speaks louder than words, and when words must end the silence. Power that never needed applause does not rely on volume. It relies on timing. Subscribe to join the journey, where